Trump just said 3 words that set off alarm bells from Havana to Beijing. We'll take it over. Not sanctions, not diplomacy, a takeover. And what happened in the 72 hours after those words will genuinely shock you. If you want news that cuts through the noise, hit subscribe right now. This is exactly what that looks like. On Friday, May 2nd at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, President Trump signed an executive order targeting Cuba with the most sweeping economic sanctions since the original embargo 67 years ago. The order locks down 3 sectors: energy, defense, and finance. It freezes the assets of named Cuban government officials. It blocks American companies from doing business with any entity tied to Cuba's military or intelligence services. That last provision is broad enough to strangle roughly 40% of Cuba's entire economy. The Treasury Department's own estimate puts the GDP contraction at 8% in year 1 alone. Cuba's economy had already contracted 2% last year. This isn't a warning shot, this is a sledgehammer. Stay with this report, because what happened 3 hours after that signing changes everything about how you should read this story. Trump stood in the Oval Office and a journalist asked him directly, is the goal regime change? His answer? We're not looking at regime change. We're looking at taking the whole thing over. We'll be taking it over almost immediately. The phrase detonated across Latin America within hours. Mexico's foreign ministry issued a formal statement calling it a concerning departure from international norms of sovereignty. Brazil's UN ambassador announced his government would oppose any action violating Cuba's territorial integrity. Cuba's foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, held a press conference the same evening. He called the sanctions economic warfare designed to starve the Cuban people into submission. And then something happened that the American press almost completely ignored. 4 days before Trump signed that order, on April 28th, the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay quietly shifted to Force Protection Condition Bravo. That is an elevated security posture, officially triggered when there is an increased or more predictable threat. 4 days before the order, not after, before. Ask yourself why the base went on high alert before the sanctions were even public. And it doesn't stop there. The USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group, a warship carrying 2,400 Marines, was deployed to waters near Cuba 2 weeks ago. The Navy called it routine training. Naval analyst Brian Clark at the Hudson Institute said the Bataan's presence gives the United States the capability to put boots on the ground in Cuba within hours, if ordered. The Fifth Fleet already had 3 destroyers operating in the Florida Straits under counter-narcotics operations. That is standard. A Marine amphibious group is not. Southern Command has 4,000 troops stationed at Guantanamo. That number has not changed, but the security posture has. And the Pentagon has been conducting classified scenario planning for Cuba contingencies since March, according to a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Classified planning, naval positioning, an amphibious assault group, and now the harshest sanctions in 67 years. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told NBC News that military action is not under consideration. A Pentagon spokesperson called Cuba contingency planning standard procedure that exists for dozens of countries. Maybe. But the timing deserves your attention. On May 1st, International Workers' Day, 100,000 people marched to the U.S. Embassy in Havana. Cuban state media broadcast it live. Crowds stretched for blocks. Signs read, "Patria o muerte." President Miguel Diaz-Canel addressed the crowd directly and said Cuba would never surrender its sovereignty. The Cuban government called the march a response to what it described as collective punishment against a population that has already endured 6 decades of blockade. Here is the part of this story that almost no one in mainstream media is asking about. Does economic pressure against Cuba actually work? Cuba survived the special period of the 1990s when GDP collapsed by 35% after Soviet subsidies vanished. The government adapted. Black markets expanded. The state held. Sanctions, historically, tend to strengthen authoritarian governments, not weaken them, because they hand the government a permanent external enemy to blame. The Cuban government has used American hostility as a political rallying point for 66 years. These sanctions give them more ammunition. Meanwhile, American companies lose access to potential markets. European and Canadian firms step in. Chinese investment in Cuban infrastructure and telecommunications deepens. Russian oil shipments continue. The military leadership, which controls most of the Cuban economy, remains largely insulated from the pain. The people absorb it. The broader geopolitical frame matters here. Trump's national security team is not primarily thinking about Cuba. They are thinking about China. Chinese intelligence facilities on Cuban soil. Russian naval visits. A strategic pressure point sitting 90 miles from Florida. Tightening the economic vice on Cuba fits a larger strategy of pushing back against Beijing's growing influence across Latin America. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz called Cuba a direct threat to American security that Washington has tolerated far too long. Senator Marco Rubio called the island a Soviet outpost that never left. The international reaction has been nearly unanimous. The United Nations General Assembly voted last November on a resolution condemning the U.S. embargo. The result? 187 nations in favor of condemnation, 2 against. The United States and Israel stood alone. Russia's foreign ministry called the sanctions another example of American aggression in the Western Hemisphere. China announced it stands with Cuba in defending its sovereignty. The European Union called for dialogue. Canada expressed concern over humanitarian impact. Inside the United States, Senator Ted Cruz praised the order as long overdue accountability. Senator Bernie Sanders called it cruel and counterproductive. Within the Cuban American community, hardline exile groups in Miami celebrated. Younger Cuban Americans, many with families still on the island, warned that sanctions hurt families, not governments. Remittances from the U.S. remain a primary income source for millions of ordinary Cubans. Here is what is confirmed. Trump signed the most comprehensive sanctions on Cuba since 1960. They target energy, defense, finance, mining, and tourism, sectors accounting for 40% of Cuba's economy. The Treasury projects an 8% GDP contraction in year 1. Guantanamo Bay elevated its security posture 4 days before the order was signed. A marine amphibious group is operating in nearby waters. 100,000 Cubans demonstrated outside the U.S. Embassy on May 1st, the largest mobilization since the protests of 2021. And 187 countries oppose the embargo. 2 support it. Here is what remains unknown. Whether this economic pressure produces political transition or simply deepens Cuba's dependence on Moscow and Beijing, while a civilian population absorbs the damage. Whether Trump's "taking it over" comment was deliberate signaling or improvised bluster. And whether the military movements near Cuba represent contingency preparation or something closer to a posture shift. The facts do not care about your politics, but your understanding of them should be precise. Think someone you know needs the real story on this? Send them this video. And drop your answer in the comments. Do you think economic sanctions against Cuba will actually work? Or are we watching history repeat itself? We cover stories like this every day, breaking them down to exactly what's confirmed, what's contested, and what the powerful hope you won't notice. If that's the kind of reporting you want more of, subscribe, and you won't miss what's coming next.